If you spent any time cruising through YouTube looking at different art videos, chances are you've seen something where you grid off paper with strips of masking tape into smaller squares or rectangles and then experiment with marks and color. And it teaches you about ignoring boundaries and just creating movement across a large surface, exploring marks and the way different colors work together. I've tried it and it's indeed a lot of fun, and I learn a lot with each process. I'm turning this around a little bit and introducing how to do it on fabric. The basics are the same, and you can use lots of different kinds of fabrics. I, as you know, really like using raw art canvas, but I've also explored with some vintage linens, some tablecloths, and then stabilized them afterwards with some fusible interfacing. I'd like to take you through some of the steps, show you some of the examples, and hopefully you'll be a little bit intrigued to think about how you might take it in a different way for yourself. Let's begin. In this case, I've decided to put it onto some linen, and I thought I'd try something pretty much similar. You know how I like the dilute gesso. I'm spreading some over the surface. I'm not overly concerned about getting every inch of it, and I expect that some of what I'm doing is going to leak through underneath the tape, but I'm going to work into something in the end in a much smaller size. With this, you can choose a specific palette. I like to suggest a more limited palette, maybe one or two colors and some neutrals. You don't want to give yourself too much choice. You want to work with the way things present themselves to react to what's on the surface, or go back in later on perhaps with more details. You could choose to do this over dry fabric. It doesn't have to be wet. I just tend to like the way the colors merge. And I'm adding some quinacridone gold that has a little bit of the Payne's gray in it. Again, just moving it across, and we're going to move into some of the greens. I'm going to take a brush and get them to move a little bit more. I could try this with a spray bottle as well. I'm going to leave that for now and come back when it has dried out slightly, and then go back in with more color. The fabric is dried, and I'm starting to think more about some landscape. I've mixed up some green, and I'm using a palette knife because I want scrapes or spreads rather than strokes across the surface. And I'm going to start over on this one. I'm not worrying about covering the surface. And if you would love something either down lower or up high, give that some consideration at this point. Of course, you're not stuck doing that. It could be altered later on. I'm mixing a few different yellows and blues. I've got cobalt, turquoise, and experimenting with different ways of coloring or different combinations of color. It's a bit grassy green for my liking. So I'm going to let this dry, but while it's doing that, I'm going to go in with some more fluid acrylic and add something else. Well, I misspoke. I said fluid acrylic, but I'm actually using this Dynaflow in a cranberry red, and because the fabric is dry, it's not going to move the color very significantly. I'm not all that thrilled with what is happening here, so I'm going to see if I can move it a little bit more with some water. And I am getting some movement here. I decided to move the green a bit more by spraying it with water and then just taking a toothbrush and pushing it across, and I'm going in a couple of directions, appearing. That gives a bit more texture, which I probably prefer at this point. Here are some of the pieces that are in different stages. Some are completed and some are into the second stage. This is one, I've added the paint and I've gone back in with some Inktense blocks. This is actually a vintage linen tablecloth. You can see how the colors have whipped underneath the tape. I'm not worried about that because these will all be trimmed down at some point. These are going to be landscape pieces, but in a very rough, abstract way. My next step here would be to put on some fusible interfacing and then prepare to add my stitching. Here are some that are finished as landscapes. I taped off 4 squares and I make them larger. These are finished to 8 inches. I would suspect these were taped to at least 9, perhaps towards 10 inches. Once I had finished adding the paints and the inks, let them dry, I cut them apart, auditioned them, and I picked out 2 that I wanted to continue working into. There is some fabric collage and there is organza and stitch. These are almost both solid stitching, and I may go back in and work on these further and bring them to the same level of completion. You could do multiples. In this case, I had a final destination, a finished product in mind, and so I worked with these 2. And then it inspires me to look differently at my landscapes, keep them very abstracted, and think about the way I could do it further into the future.